Prior to War 117, we experienced one of the shortest wars in Foxhole history, and because of how this war started, most of the Foxhole player base thought this would be another short war. No one expected that War 117 would last 50 days, making it the second longest war in Foxhole history, and no one certainly thought that this would be the deadliest war in Foxhole history with the most casualties we've ever seen. This war was truly a war that will not be forgotten, and that will go down as one of the best wars that we have ever had. The back and forth from the Colonials and the Wardens was truly amazing. In this video, I'll be going through the events day by day to explain how this war developed. Day 1. Within the first few hours of the war, we saw an ambitious offensive from the Colonials. They surged forward to claim vast amounts of western territories. In rapid succession, they seized almost all of King's Cage, Fairnet Coast, and 3/4 of Stone Cradle. In the middle of the map in the Deadlands, a group of Colonials maimed and rushed Callahan's Boot non-stop. Callahan's Boot is always one of the most fought over towns at the start of a war. A group of Colonials moved up towards the Blade Road to the north to cut off Warden logistics to Callahan's Boot. The group then split up, the bigger group heading towards the crossroads to the east of the Blade, and a smaller group to the west to see if Logi was being redirected. The larger group was able to take out 4 Logi trucks. Because this Colonial group was able to cut off vital Logi supplies for the Wardens, Callahan's Boot was taken by the Colonials quickly. On the east side of the map in Endless Shore, Regiments IG and the 6th teamed up and prepared partisan attacks. Troops and trucks were loaded on barges, and this launched the war's first naval invasion just southwest of Saltbrook. The Wardens got barges of their own, and both teams duked it out in the water. The Colonials eventually came out on top and secured most of Endless Shore on the first day. At the start of day 2, the Wardens pushed back, determined to reclaim lost ground. They retook regions in Stone Cradle and began clawing back territory along Fairnet Coast. By the end of day 2, the Wardens continued their advance in Stone Cradle, leaving the Colonials with only one remaining territory in the region. During the fight in Stone Cradle, the Wardens also managed to push back in Endless Shore towards Saltbrook, reclaiming some territory in the east as well. The aggression from the Colonials on day 3 would haunt the Wardens for the next several weeks. A Warden soldier reports spawning into Endless Shore wanting to go fight in Saltbrook. This soldier has normally joined this fight in the past because they love the urban fights that happen at the start of the war. But unfortunately for this Warden soldier, the Colonials were already pushing the Wardens out of the city. They were fighting on the outskirts of the city when the soldier arrived. The soldier recalls while fighting on the outskirts of Saltbrook, Brackish Point, located north of Saltbrook, had fallen. The Colonials had surrounded the Wardens that remained in the region near the old Jack Tar. Another Warden had this to say about the fight. "I give credit to the Colonials we were fighting. They managed to encircle us quick and starve us out within hours. Very impressive, even though it was an absolute disaster for us Wardens fighting there." End quote. Near the middle of the map, Colonials had swept through Mercy's Wish and into the Linn of Mercy. A Warden reports spawning in the First Coin, a city in the southern region of the Linn of Mercy, which serves as a critical choke point defense for the major city of Ulster Falls. When the Warden soldiers spawned in, Colonial armored cars and infantry were already swarming and already close to the base. It was touch and go for a while. The Wardens were putting up a good fight and holding the Colonials back. A Warden armored car eventually joined the fight to help push the Colonials back, but the Colonials kept sending wave after wave, pushing the Wardens inch by inch back towards their base in the First Coin. By the end of day 3, the Wardens would lose the First Coin and the Crimson Gardens, a city to the northwest. In the final 6 hours of day 3, a desperate last stand took place at the Treasury in the Claustra. The Wardens were holding a small choke point into the Treasury as the Colonials swarmed in from Transept to the south. The Colonials also managed to sneak some soldiers to the north of the Treasury to cut some Logi off as well. However, the Wardens managed to hold the Treasury that day, but this would not be the last battle for the Treasury. By the end of the war, the Treasury and the region Claustra would hold the record for most casualties in a single hex nearing 900,000. At the start of day 4, the Colonial forces pressed on into Stone Cradle, edging closer to capturing the region. On this day, a new Colonial player tells the story of running logistics from Fairmore and Lockmore up to the First Coin. Unfortunately for this soldier, while waiting to get into the region, Warden partisans would attack the Logi route and take out 2 Logi trucks full of supplies attempting to aid the First Coin. I was able to grab a quote from this soldier. "War is hell. No one plays fair. Okay, Wardens, I see how it is. Game on." End quote. By the end of day 4, the Colonials would take most of Stone Cradle, leaving the Wardens with 1 territory left. The biomass from the Regiment 420 clan would send wave after wave at the Treasury, but the Wardens would hold. Meanwhile, in Endless Shore, the Colonials would capture the entire region. On day 5, the Colonials would capture the Linn of Mercy, securing the strategic city of Ulster Falls. Elsewhere, skirmishes flared up, but territories held steady. On day 6, Operation Dresno plan would take place. This operation came in 2 phases. The first phase would have Joan 2 land on Sunder Beach and Fairnet Coast. With artillery recently being researched, the regiment's 14 KS would fire shells to destroy enemy defenses. Jotun landed successfully on the beach and pushed onto the mainland towards Scrap of Ambrose. Unfortunately, the Colonials sent more soldiers to defend against this attack and pushed the landing party back. Warden infantry started to add support from the bridge to the north. The Jontun Regiment during this operation fired 1,500 shells at the enemy and destroyed everything. Unfortunately, no major gains were made during this operation, but the Wardens were successful at destroying defenses and infrastructure. Back at the treasury, the Colonials at one point during this day had pushed the Wardens to their town hall and destroyed it. Artillery was raining down all over the place, one player reports. A member from the Warden Regiment 82DK tells the story of having a group of soldiers get into motorboats and gunboats to flank around where the artillery gun was firing from. They were successfully able to take out the artillery guns and stop the firing. This helped the Wardens push back into the city and build back the town hall. Towards the end of day 6, the Wardens made some territorial gains in Claustra. They pushed the Colonials away from the treasury and took transit thanks to 82DK and NOD and other soldiers as well. On day 7 of the war, the Colonials had started to push into the moors towards the north middle side of the region. The Wardens by the end of the day were able to repel most of this territorial gain, but overall things were not looking good for the Wardens on the west side. Just southeast of the moors, the Colonials had taken all of the Deadlands on this day. Once again though, the largest battle was taking place in Claustra near the treasury. Colonial artillery unleashed a 3-hour bombardment on the treasury. Despite nearly 10,000 shells fired, the Wardens endured, holding fast against impossible odds. Their tenacity at the treasury had become legendary. The Colonial Regiment, the 421st, had started this massive artillery campaign against the treasury. The artillery operation was also supported by Steel Regiment, who provided fire rockets. One Colonial soldier recalls not being able to take the treasury this day because of the massive counterattack that came from 3rd Chapter. By the end of day 7, the Wardens had managed to hold their ground and prevent the Colonials from taking the treasury. Starting on day 8, the Colonials on the west side were able to take all of Stone Cradle and push the Wardens into Callum's Cape, a major logistics hub for the Wardens. One new Warden Logi player reports losing holdout in Callum's Cape and thought about giving up, assuming that the Colonials would take the dredge, and the Wardens would then lose vital logistics structures like the mass production factory. This new Warden Logi player decided not to give up and decided to grab a rifle and join the front line, which was threatening to take their Logi home. The new player followed the commands of vet players on the field. When the vet players pushed, they pushed, and when the vet players hunkered down in the trench, they hunkered down. The Wardens were able to defend the dredge from being taken and take back Callum's Cape. This was a quote from that new Warden Logi player. And when finally Callum's Cape was all blue, I jumped from my chair. It was exciting and my morale went high. Sure, the chance of us winning this war was still low, but I am starting to believe that we Warden, are still capable of putting up a fight and not letting the Colonials have their quick win again. End quote. I loved this quote. I feel like a lot of us Foxhole players have felt the same energy before. Day 8 was not over yet though. While the Wardens were pushing the Colonials out of Callum's Cape, a group of Warden players decided to harass Colonial players in Stone Cradle, cutting off vital Navy logistics supplies from coming to aid the Callum Capes fight. Though this victory in the west was needed for the Warden morale, an unfortunate event would happen to the east. The Colonials would advance into the treasury and seize control of the territory. A couple of regiments from the Colonial side had joined the fight, Shred and Og. They destroyed the bridge to the north with gunboats and set up a bunker base close to the town hall. Of course, this was aided by other regiments and players as well for this victory. Claustra and the treasury were an absolute bloodbath since the start of the war. The Colonials had initially lost the rush for the treasury at the start of the war, which began its siege. It formed a stalemate at the south bottleneck, which lasted 8 days. It was a tough-fought battle with neither side ever letting up. The Colonials would hold the treasury for now. On day 9 of the war, the Wardens had some cleaning up to do on the west side. During the day, the Wardens would regain many territories in the moor and one territory in Stone Cradle. The Wardens were finally starting to come out of their shell and starting to come back from that devastating start. No other territories on this day saw any major changes. Day 10 of the war, the Wardens continued their campaign in the west, pushing the Colonials out of the moors and regaining some territory in Stone Cradle and Faranac Coast. No other territory exchanged hands in the middle of the map or towards the east. The war was beginning to slow down. On day 11, no major territories were exchanged on the east side or the middle of the map once again. Stone Cradle region continued to see Wardens pushing back the Colonials, with Colonials giving some resistance. Near the end of the day, though, some harassment from the Warden Navy started to happen, and leading into day 12, one of the first big naval invasions would occur. A Colonial player report that was sent to me stated this: the Warden Navy launched a 2-day attack against El Camino Estate in the Stemma Landing Island region. The Warden Navy brought 4 frigates and 2 longhooks, and a couple of gunboats and some barges. They had caught the Colonials by complete surprise. The frigates had started to shell El Camino Estate and had destroyed their seaport and coastal gun. A wave of Colonial soldiers came to defend the island and started repairing the town hall. Unfortunately for the Wardens, El Camino Estate was a tough island to conduct landing invasions. The Colonials were able to fight back their landing boats with ease. One of the Warden longhooks even tried to dock at the destroyed seaport, only to be hit by massive amounts of Colonial fire. Eventually, the Wardens had to retreat retreat as their landing had been unsuccessful. Though the Wardens were unsuccessful, this day marked the beginning of their aggressive naval tactics. Day 12 saw no major territories exchanged. Both factions were in a stalemate, pushing one another back and forth and back and forth. At the start of Day 13, the Wardens pushed across the bridge in Farragut Coast, and were slowly chipping away at the Colonials. The Wardens had also attempted a tank operation to push them back into Claustra, but this attack was shut down right away by regiments like 420th, Shred, 454th, and CL. During Day 14, the Wardens continued to hold strong in all of their territories. The Wardens even saw some territory gain in Marbin Hollows. This region has seen a lot of territory go back and forth, but not much gain by either side during the course of this war. Marbin Hollows has not been talked about so far during this summary, as I didn't receive many reports from the battles that took place here. This is a good time to remind players that if they want any of their stories told, to join the Discord in the description below, and report on the battles that you fight at. They could possibly be added to the next war summary for the next war. With renewed intensity, the Colonials on Day 15 struck Stone Cradle again, refusing to concede this territory. No other territories saw any major shifts on this day. On Day 16, more fighting was going on in the west. A Warden frontline engineer recalls having to build up a lot of defenses in the moors to defend Headstone from a wave of Colonial tanks. There were only a handful of Warden engineers building up defenses at Headstone, trying to make sure the Colonials didn't take it. Unfortunately, by the end of the day, the Colonials would take most of the moors once again. While this was going on, the Wardens managed to push back into the Endless Shore, taking Sidfall, but it didn't take the Colonials long to push back into Stilken Shelf. The regiment ECH played a big part in cutting off Logi from the Wardens and helped eventually push them back. On Day 17 of the war, the Wardens held their ground on the west side, but the east side was starting to crumble. Most of Marbin Hollows and Stilken Shelf had been taken by the Colonials. Colonials were starting their attack on the port of Rhyme. A Warden player shared this report from the battle. The Colonial forces managed to capture Vulpine Watch. Not long after that, the relic based at Fort Hoarfrost was seized. Half a dozen map posts appeared over our defenses, the faction expecting a repeat of the Siege of Rhyme in War 115. But this time we were ready. The Colonials were met with a massive 4-gun artillery barrage, pre-sighted at the relic base at Hoarfrost. An ammo factory was prepared right on top of the guns, filled with thousands and thousands of shells. 3 layers of dry concrete stood between them and the Rhyme Town Hall, not including the city's infamous walls prepped with pallets of tripods and bone saws. Starbreakers were armed and ready in concrete pits. Within just a couple of hours, the Colonials had been pushed back all the way to the border at Endless Shore by a well-supplied Warden counterattack. For the remainder of the war, the Colonials would never reach the port of Rhyme. Stilken Shelf would soon no longer be a front line. Leading into Day 18, the Wardens were able to push the Colonials back out of Stilken Shelf. What had pushed the Colonials back was a rare sight of a battle train. An armored train run by the Warden Regiment, the 6th, slammed into the Colonials and destroyed their advancing tanks. During this time, the Wardens were able to make some good gains in Marbin Hollows as well. The Wardens would also continue to harass the Colonials and stem a landing with constant navy assaults from frigates and battleships. On Day 19 of the war, a Colonial regiment named San gave away 100 Spatha Colonial tanks. It took the Somme players 3 days to build all of these tanks for their fellow soldiers to use. Some of these tanks were used in a massive tank battle that took place in the north part of the Claustra. One player reports that this was the largest tank battle since War 112, which was considered the War of World of Tanks. The 420 regiment decided to do a massive falchion push using sheer numbers, and they called it Falchion Fest. Many other regiments were included on this, such as Steel, UCF, Elite, Pink, Shred, GBD, ECH, CL, and others. But the Wardens retaliated and had taken the vault and were pushing back towards the treasury. A stalemate occurred when they were reaching the bridge. It was at this time that the 420 launched a counter-offensive. They took advantage of the low-costing falchion tanks and used them very aggressively with a high casualty rate. The Colonials eventually pushed the Wardens back into the vault and destroyed it with artillery and their swarm of tanks. One Colonial player quotes this: "The Wardens fought very hard to keep that relic, but we eventually pushed them back." End quote. On Day 20 of the war, the Wardens had completely taken back the moors. From one player's report, the Wardens had brought up a massive tank line, including heavy tanks and cruiser tanks, which helped push the Colonials out of the region. At the same time all of this was happening, another Warden naval invasion was taking place in Stemma Landing, and I was actually a part of this battle. During this invasion, the Wardens had a few battleships, some frigates, and a longhook. Luckily, we were able to hold them off. The Wardens managed to destroy some of our defenses on Spearhead and take a few of the smaller islands during the invasion. On Day 21, though, we saw a lot of back and forth between the Colonials and the Wardens. The Colonials had started to gain some territory in Callahan's Passage and were starting to chip away at the Wardens in the middle of the map. On Day 22, the Colonials on the west had pushed past the bridges in Farragut Coast and into the Nevish Line. But the very next day, on Day 23, the Wardens would push the Colonials out of Nevish Line. Stone Cradle remained mainly in Colonial hands, Marvin Hollow continued to go back and forth on the east side, and Stilcan Shelf continued to go back and forth as well. The only battle that saw any territory exchanged on day 24 was when the Colonials had pushed into Callahan's Passage, giving them access to half the region. With the arrival of day 25, we were now halfway through this war. This is what the map looked like on this day. Colonials still had a slight advantage, and the Wardens still held their ground. A war we all thought would be over by day 15 was still ongoing, and no side was giving up anytime soon. On this day, the Wardens had a massive counterattack that helped them regain some territory in Stone Cradle, but unfortunately a little to the west, the Colonials were once again pushing into the Nevish line. On day 26, the Wardens attacked Stemma Landing for the 6th time, capturing all of the small islands around it. They had 3 battleships, 2 frigates, 2 longhooks, and a submarine. 1 battleship got sunk by a QRF of 24 Colonial gunboats, and the other 2 retreated with heavy damage. The Wardens tried to land this time on the northeastern part of El Camino Estate, only to be quickly pushed back into the sea. The Wardens had also managed to shell the port of El Camino Estate, destroying the refinery and a couple of bunker bases and the garrisons. In the end, the Warden landing failed once again, and the Colonials eventually took all of the islands back. One Colonial reports this: "It's been a while since I've seen collies actually working together as one. The defense against the landing was organized chaos." End quote. During this invasion, the Colonials had taken more territory in Callahan's Passage, and were going back and forth with Wardens in all other regions. Finally, on day 27, Stemma Landing would start to fall to the Wardens. The Wardens had brought in yet another Navy force that was able to take out massive concrete bases on Spearhead Island. The operation to take Spearhead Island lasted 7 hours and consisted of regiments like Scum, 11E, Telephone, 300, and others. There were 2 battleships, 3 frigates, and 3 submarines in total. At about the same time, the Wardens also launched a massive land assault, which helped them push back into the Claustra. Over the last several days, the Colonials started making gains in the moors, and on day 28, they had half the region under their control. All other regions remained the same with no major territory gains. On day 29 of the war, everything would change. The war had escalated to new heights as the first nuclear bomb was dropped in Fisherman's Row. The nuke had come from a Colonial force from Westgate, but the Wardens decided to retaliate and had their own nuke aimed at the treasury. 21 days ago, this prized city had been won by the Colonials, and soon it would be turned into ash. The Warden player that built the nuke site sent me this report. "In a day's time, I made the nuke and placed it in Foxcatcher. This nuke will strike hard into the logistics hub the Colonials have in the treasury." End quote. The Colonials had started evacuations of supplies from storage depots. Everyone was preparing for the worst, but some Colonial players had other plans. They thought that pushing into Foxcatcher would be a viable strategy to try and stop the nuke from firing. For those of you that don't know, once a nuke is built and a target is selected, it takes 48 real-world hours until it's launched. The Colonials would need to act fast if they wanted to stop this nuke from landing. The Colonials were not going to let this important frontline town die without a fight, so a plan was devised on day 30 by all major regiments and coalitions to attack the Foxcatcher with all they had. Summon Gron, the Hammer of the Underworld, to break Foxcatcher's formidable concrete defenses and destroy the nuke before it could turn the treasury into paste. Gron was 3 rail storm cannons firing in unison at the same target. A very effective way to stop a nuke, but before the mighty siege could start, the road to Foxcatcher had to be paved. The Claustra's northern regions were still controlled by the Wardens, so a large push out of the treasury led by several tank groups and 150mm artillery from the treasury was used to capture the Volt Relic base. After destroying a lot of in-placed Warden defenses, the tanks managed to break through and capture it. Several Warden bunker bases were north of the relic, but these 2 were crushed and captured soon after. The next step was to push east and take 3rd chapter. The town was recently destroyed, so the only thing defending it was Warden soldiers. Very few AI or supporting bunker bases were nearby. The WLL Special Operations Team assisted by cutting Logi off from the north, clearing pillbox defenses, and striking Warden tanks under the cover of the night. A few Silverhands and Chieftains were patrolling the streets of 3rd chapter, but nothing a few RPGs and sticky bombs couldn't remove. With the lack of supplies and no tank support, the 3rd chapter was quickly destroyed and captured. This initiated the second hurdle for this operation: border bases. Between Weathered Expanse and the Claustra lies 3 border bases: the West Road border base, the North border base between 3rd chapter and the Vault, and the East border base near the 4 pillars. All 3 had to be controlled by Colonials for Gron to work. This was going to be a difficult task. When 3rd chapter fell, all border bases were claimed by the Wardens, so an immediate back and forth battle between infinite spawning Wardens and Colonial tanks erupted. The majority of pushback had to be from the Colonial tanks, since the Colonial infantry was secretly grabbing shovels and wrenches to clear the path for rails. The Wardens also brought the fight from Foxcatcher too. through. Several Warden armored divisions, notably KRGG, 82DK, and H-Ward, pushed across the border to support the Warden infantry forces in several skirmishes to take back 3rd Chapter and assault the build effort north of the Treasury. The WLL Special Operations Team was well on hand to find and dispose of these tanks. In several instances, as the Warden tanks crossed the border, the team flanked behind them and used sticky bombs and RPGs to disable and track the heavy armor. Battle tanks, noble windows, and several other medium tanks were taken out during this exchange. After several back and forth skirmishes, the Wardens eventually retreated back into the weathered expanse to prepare for their Helm's Deep defense of Foxcatcher. Grand was coming, and the Colonials controlled all 3 border bases. Now it was time to begin the assault on weathered expanse. With the defenses prepped and their rails in place, the Colonial strike team started invading weathered expanse using all 3 border bases at once. A key focus was placed on attacking the western front first, since it was most likely tier 2 defenses. This was also the easiest way into weathered expanse because the majority of Foxcatcher was built with large concrete fortresses protected by 150mm artillery and 94.5mm starbreakers. The Colonial tank divisions put a lot of pressure south of Necropolis to pull the Warden defenders away from Foxcatcher. The plan worked, and several Warden tanks and infantry left their artillery to help defend the base. This allowed a secret Colonial engineering team to cross on the east and middle border to start building the secondary bases, another layer of defenses for Grand and staging area for the attacking force. With the Warden armor distracted on the west, and a well-entrenched Colonial presence built up on the east, the main objective of the attack could commence. The guns of Grand had started. Like a swift and deadly wind, the 300mm shells fired from the 4 pillars and rained upon the Warden city. The Wardens, in a desperate attempt, brought in their own railstorm cannon to fire back at Grand, but it could not match the accuracy and tempo of the seasoned Colonial artillery crew. Grand quickly devoured the opposing rail cannons without a loss, but the Wardens had a backup plan. In place storm cannons. Several cannons were situated between Foxcatcher and Necropolis, which started to fire at Grand as well. However, due to using these cannons for a prior operation earlier in the day, the Warden guns could not sustain a counterattack for long. With no way to attack Grand without leaving weathered expanse, the Warden city was at the mercy of the mighty guns. For 3 in-game days and 3 nights, Grand sieged the Warden city, busting every concrete bunker piece and emplaced artillery position to dust. Colonial army was on the march. Grand had opened the gates and the Green Horde entered into Foxcatcher. Inside the town, a lot of intense husk fighting took place. Wardens jumped into every crevice and broken bunker piece they could find to hold back the endless wave of Colonial infantry. The Colonials still had one goal: destroy the nuke, and every ounce of effort was put into completing that objective. The WLL Special Operations Team continued to assault the Warden tanks defending the town, but also switched to support roles with several team members running Logi from the Treasury to the frontline bunkers, bringing much-needed tremolas and havoc charges to clear up any remaining Warden defenses. And several key plays took place during this time. The Colonial combat engineers used havoc charges and lunaires to support ballistas, destroying the concrete cores Wardens were spawning in. Colonial special operation teams snuck behind enemy lines, destroying 150mm guns and starbreakers and garrison houses. 2 Colonial SPGs drove into the Hust base and started to attack the defenses near the nuke, surviving several counterattacks from howitzer retaliation, and even a tank QRF flank from the east. All of these fights around the nuke were intense. They went back and forth with Warden tanks and Colonial tanks, both having support from infantry as well. Several regiments were battling in this tank battle: Somme and Shred and Steel. These regiments, along with other players as well, were bashing into the Warden defenses, trying to get to the nuke before it launched. After several hours of intense fighting, Foxcatcher could not hold, and the endless green wave of tanks, infantry, artillery, logi, and special operations toppled the Warden's launch site, destroying their nuke on day 30 of this war with the final daring ballista rush from the 404th. The WLL Special Operations Team, codename Hobo 2, finally rested, exhausted from non-stop QRF duties to defend Grand, and supporting the attack in Foxcatcher through logistics and partisan duties. This had to be one of the biggest and most successful operations during War 117. Well done to everyone who was involved, and thank you to Legendary from WLL who sent this report to me. One of the best war reports I've ever received. With the nuke no longer targeting the Treasury, the Wardens would need to regroup and come up with a new plan. Despite their morale taking a significant blow from losing their only nuke site, the Wardens refused to give up. On day 31, the Wardens launched a naval invasion into the Fingers, an island revered by the Colonials. Colonials every war build up the Fingers. These soldiers do everything they can to protect their island hex, and have even given themselves the name the Free State of the Fingers. They have their own culture and way of living on this island, and on this day they were finally under attack from the powerful Warden Navy. On the mainland, during the Fingers fight, many of the hexes would only see territory traded back and forth. The main focus for each faction would be the fight for the Fingers. On day 32, the Wardens would spend all day taking every territory within the Fingers, and would lose it all from a counter-colonial attack. With the Wardens focusing heavily on the Fingers, the Colonials capitalized on attacking the Moors, launching another offensive attack on day 33. Once again on this day, the Warden Navy would launch another push against the Fingers. Like every other battle of this war, they were not giving up without a fight. Over on the mainland, all territories remained the same with no major gains from either faction. The Warden Navy prevailed on day 34, and was able to take almost every territory in the Fingers once again. One last colonial base was holding strong and using everything they had to hold them off. One player reports this about the invasion of the Fingers. The Fingers have been a battlefield as of recently. TBFC and other regiments have been holding off against the Warden Navy. See Scum, 82 DK, and other regiments. For 4 straight days, the old captain in the Fingers has been besieged and now has fallen. We fought wave after wave of soldiers, tanks, and ships. Elements of 82 DK, the Warden Navy, Spud, and others were present, and eventually they all pushed through. We Colonials made them fight for every inch. There was a faction known as the Last Faction that fought to the bitter end. One of TBFC's leaders was the last Colonial in the Fingers, and fought the Wardens to the last bullet and died historically stabbing Wardens with his bayonet. The next day, on day 35 of the war, the Fingers would finally fall and the Colonials would be forced to retreat into Reaver's Pass. On this day, the Colonials launched their second nuke of the war, spreading further devastation across the land. This time the nuke was aimed at Buckler Sound in Stone Cradle on the mainland on the northwest side of the map. The Wardens were not going to let the nukes distract them. On day 36 of the war, the Wardens continued their naval assault into Reaver's Path just southwest of the Fingers. They slowly started to chip away at the Colonial defenses. One player reports that Reaver's Pass was not heavily fortified because Colonials never thought the Wardens would get this far into Colonial territory. With the Wardens putting most of their force and supplies into the attack down south, all other territories on this day remained the same. During day 37, the Wardens would see major gains in Reaver's Pass as they continued their invasion in the south. The Colonials were spread thin but still holding strong on the mainland. During day 38, back and forth skirmishes happened in Callahan's Passage and on the east coast and Endless Shore in Reaver's Pass. The Colonials also built another nuke site that targeted the Moors. On day 39, back and forth battles happened again in Callahan's Passage, Endless Shore, and Reaver's Pass. And finally on day 40, things would change. The Wardens were unable to stop the nuke being launched at the Moors, and Ogmarin was destroyed. In the west at Bonehaft and Farinac Coast, the battle was still raging on. The fight between Bonehaft and the Scrap of Ambrose has been going on since day 1 of this war. For 40 days, soldiers have been fighting back and forth across this bridge. One Warden player had this to report about the battle. In my hometown of Bonehaft, we held our ground in full defensive mode. We were the wall preventing the Colonials from getting close to Nevish Line. The environment consisted of a bottleneck bridge battle and a rail bridge surrounded by claustrophobic suburbs of scorched houses and supplied by a hospital to sustain our shirt surplus. The Colonials had a tough challenge ahead. We Wardens covered every possible passage with barbed wire, making movement difficult for both sides. The Colonials brought a destroyer near the Scythe Beaches to try and hammer our long-standing Bonehaft relic base. They managed to chip away some concrete. That's when they realized they needed more artillery to make a real dent in Bonehaft's defenses. After 5 hours, the Colonials hadn't made much progress. Then, according to other Warden reports, they deployed 3 150mm cannons and 2 SPGs by the Scrap of Ambrose to intensify pressure on Bonehaft's defenses. We tried to respond with our 120mm cannons, but they outgunned us. The heavy shelling on our relic base continued for 40 minutes to an hour and a half. Our troops firmly rooted to the ground as we burned through B-mats. Slowly, we adapted to the Colonial artillery patterns, with Warden tanks supporting us and fighting their armored cars on the bridge. The shelling managed to destroy our storage depot twice, but sheer Warden determination allowed us to repair faster. Ultimately, the Wardens successfully won the defense of Nevish Line Hex. After the siege was over, the Wardens from Bonehaft launched a counterattack. Warden infantry and tanks repaired the bridge and pushed into the Scrap of Ambrose. We fought in a tug-of-war with the Colonials for control of the territory." End quote. While this battle was happening, directly to the north, the Wardens had built a nuke site in Nevish Line and had aimed the nuke at Jade Cove. On day 41, no major territories were taken on the mainland. Both factions were hunkered down holding what territory they had, though one soldier had this to report about the defense of Terminus from the advancing Wardens from Reaver's Pass. A combined Colonial effort pushed the Warden forces threatening Terminus. Initial morale in Terminus was surprisingly high, with regiments like SOM, Ox, 420, NCR, UBGE, and others all working together to throw back the Warden advance. The Colonial force managed to stop the invasion into Terminus and push the Wardens back to Keelhaul. Colonial forces were closing in on Keelhaul when I put out the word to the 420 squads to add their biomass to the assault. Multiple 420 members joined the fight and some were already there. fire. A NCR artillery group used 5 150mm artillery guns and aimed them at Keelhaul as the combined Colonial force pushed them into the town and eventually overwhelmed the Warden defenders. The Wardens attempted to build up a defense, but it quickly crumbled due to the surprise and sheer overwhelming numbers of the Colonials. After taking Keelhaul, the Colonials continued their campaign towards Breakwater. The Wardens had more defenses around Breakwater, but the Colonial assault rolled right over them. Colonial morale was too high. Our numbers were bolstered and our logistics seemed endless. The Warden defenses outside the city were once again overrun. Finally, we pushed into Breakwater itself, but this is where the Wardens really dug in. Warden forces began pulling everything from the storage depots. Many Warden tanks joined the battle. This battle was a great example of how morale plays a role in large battles like this. There were tanks when the Warden tanks would try to punch out to the west and push the Colonials back, and the Colonial infantry just wouldn't move. In fact, I witnessed 420 members and other Colonial forces just ignoring the pushing Warden tanks and advancing past them to attack the Warden infantry that was trying to push up and to take advantage of the gaps their tanks had just made. We Colonials felt pretty much invincible at this point. After some back and forth battles around the outskirts of the western entrance to Breakwater, it seemed like the Wardens might actually hold out. Colonial resupply and assaults were relentless, but the Wardens were equally determined. The battle dragged on into the early hours of the morning in the US. The Colonial destroyer returned home victorious as its crew wanted to sleep, and the main Colonial force on the mainland was also slowly losing steam as folks called it a night. The Warden defenses, though, eventually fell apart a few hours later. Only Scuttletown and the region would remain in Warden hands. It was an incredible fight that really gave the Eastern Colonials a huge morale boost. End quote. Back on the western fronts, the Wardens held strong and kept the Colonials at a Nevish line. The nuke for Jade Cove had successfully launched, and on day 42, Jade Cove was destroyed. This would be the 4th nuke to go off during this war. The western side of the map was a wasteland. By this point, capturing any territories on the west side would be challenging due to stretched supply lines. The Colonials now needed 5 victory points to win the war, making it essential for them to concentrate their attacks on the middle and eastern regions of the map. The Colonials were left with 4 fronts that could be advanced and easily supplied with logistics: Callahan's Passage, Marben Hollows, the Claustra, and Endless Shore. But the Wardens had other plans for the Claustra. The Wardens had once again set up a nuke site in the weathered expanse and had targeted the treasury with another nuke. While this nuke was preparing to launch, the Warden Navy would break the Colonial defenses in Reavers Pass and take the entire region, pushing the Colonials back into Terminus to the south. On day 43, the 5th nuke of the war was launched. The treasury, a city that was once fiercely contested at the start of the war, had now become a desolate wasteland. Over towards the middle of the map, the Wardens had finally pushed the Colonials out of Callahan's Passage and started moving their forces into the Deadlands. During this day, the Foxhole community broke the record for most casualties in a single war. War 100 had the previous record with 6,625,890 deaths. War 117 was now the deadliest war in Foxhole history. By day 44, burnout was beginning to set in for the Colonials. The real battle had now shifted to morale and mental resilience. The Colonials were losing ground in every region, and for the first time since day 5 of the war, the Wardens had returned successfully to the Deadlands. Despite the treasury having been nuked, on day 45, the 420 biomass pushed forward. Undeterred in their attacks against the Wardens, the Colonials continued to fight fiercely in the east, engaging in a back-and-forth struggle with the Wardens. After 45 days, the map now resembled the starting point of the war. The Wardens had fought their way back to where it all began. During day 46 of the war, the Colonials had managed to set up 4 different nuke sites in the Linn of Mercy and aimed their nukes at Callahan's Passage. During this time, the Wardens were marching in the west, reclaiming all of Farinac Coast and starting their assault into King's Cage. On day 47, after a 20-hour battle, the Wardens attempted to attack the nuke sites at the Linn of Mercy, but the Colonials held their ground. One Warden soldier reported getting close enough to the nuke site with their tank to take a shot, only to be destroyed before they could fire. Callahan's Passage would receive the 6th and final nuke of this war. This left Marben Hollows and Endless Shore as the only fronts not to be nuked this war. By the end of the 47th day, for the first time this war, the Wardens took the lead in victory points. On day 48, the Wardens began tearing through each territory like paper, making significant gains in the east while steadily advancing in the west, capturing all of King's Cage and parts of Lockmore. On this day, the Colonials would finally be pushed out of the Claustra and Endless Shore. Claustra would set another record for the Foxhole community. The Claustra would become the deadliest hex in Foxhole history with over 886,000 deaths. As the eastern regions began to collapse, the Wardens managed to capture most of Alod's Bight and continued a fierce back-and-forth struggle with the Colonials in Reavers Pass and Terminus. At the start of day 49 of the war, the Wardens only needed 3 victory points to win. During this day, the Wardens moved quickly through Sableport and Shackled Chasm, leaving them with just 1 victory point remaining to secure victory. Day 50, the final day of War 117. There were 4 main battles going on during this day, one in Origin, another in the Heartlands, next in Umbral Wildwood, and last in Terminus. The Colonials in all these regions were making a last stand, not wanting to be the last region to fall in the war. The Wardens were attempting naval invasions in the the Origin, they were fighting outside the walls of the Blemish in the Heartlands, they were quickly destroying all defenses in Umbral Wildwood and marching towards Hermit's Rest, and finally they were surrounding Terminus and shelling the town hall from the sea. The Wardens would first take Hermit's Rest in Umbral Wildwood. Once the last victory point was taken, the Wardens needed to hold on to it for 10 minutes to win the war. And just before it seemed as though the Colonials would lose, a small special force of Colonials snuck behind enemy lines and reclaimed Silk Farms and Shackled Chasm. Though this was a valiant effort from the Colonials, it only delayed the inevitable. The Wardens would quickly regain Silk Farms and take Hermit's Rest in Umbral Wildwood once again and win the war. The war was finally over, and this war would surely end as one of the best wars in Foxhole history. Many notable achievements and records were set this war. After what seemed like would be one of the shortest Foxhole wars, turned out to be the second longest war in Foxhole history. It was the second best comeback war we had ever seen. As mentioned before, this would be the deadliest war in Foxhole history. And finally, this war witnessed the most nukes we have ever seen launched in a single war, with a total of 6 going off. This is truly a war we will not forget. Thank you to the Wardens and the Colonials and the Foxhole community for making this such a great war. What was your favorite part of War 117? Let me know in the comments. This has been my 3rd war summary video. If you have any feedback about how I could improve these war summary videos, feel free to let me know in the comments. Also, if you have a story to tell during a war, feel free to join my Discord and share the story for future war summary videos. Thank you all so much for watching and for your support. Make sure to subscribe for more Foxhole content. I'll see you out on the battlefield. Cheers.